And now a look at financial fraud and consumer scams. We're joined once again by John Breyault, Vice President of Public Policy, Telecommunications, and Fraud at the National Consumers League. John Breyault, for folks unfamiliar with NCL, what's your organization?
NCL is a national consumer advocacy organization. We've been around since 1899, which makes us the oldest consumer protection organization in the U.S. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, and we're based here in Washington, D.C.
And joining us today, a day before taxes are due, before tax day. And so let's talk about some of the most common tax scams out there.
Sure. So some of the most common tax scams that consumers will encounter are, number one, what we call the impersonation scam. This is where people who often claim to be with the IRS, the police, or some other kind of government agency will call and say that you owe taxes. And if you don't pay them right now, you're going to go to jail or have a negative credit report or be deported. So that's what we wanted to warn consumers about. We also wanted to warn consumers about using tax preparers who may not be licensed in their state or who may be out to do things like put false refund information on your return so that the tax preparer gets a bigger fee. That's another big one we want to warn consumers about. And finally, we want to make sure consumers are aware that the data that they are using to file their tax return is actually very valuable to scammers who want to send phishing emails. So we're telling consumers to keep that data as safe and secure as possible, and also to their employers, because employers are increasingly getting targeted by phishing scams trying to get that employee W-2 information.
So on the impersonation scams that you started with there, how do you detect that? How do you defend against it?
Well, first of all, know that impersonation scams tend to come most often over the phone. So if someone calls you over the phone and says they're with the IRS or the Federal Trade Commission or the FBI and demands money, that is the biggest red flag. That is not how those agencies contact consumers, particularly not how the IRS contacts consumers. They'll contact you by the mail first. Secondly, if they ask for payment via something like a wire transfer or prepaid debit card, that's another big red flag of fraud. And number three, just be aware that when they want payment right away, that's because they're trying to get you to send money without thinking first. They're trying to make you afraid. And so that's a third big red flag that we're telling consumers to be aware of this tax season.
And we're telling our viewers to give us a call if you have questions or comments or stories about these consumer fraud scams. Want to hear from you. Split our phone lines up regionally, 202-748-8000 if you're in the Eastern or Central time zones, 202-748-8001 if you're in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. On the impersonation scams with the IRS, it was a topic at a hearing earlier this spring. The Treasury Department's Inspector General for Tax Administration was testifying and talked about some of the changing tactics used in that scam this year. Here's a bit from that hearing.
April 2016, that there was a shift to the iTunes card as a method of payment. They also redoubled their efforts on their auto dialer program, so they're able to make hundreds of thousands of telephone calls in a very short order. When the scam, to your point exactly, when the scam first started, it was individuals calling one-on-one. And then when they shifted to the auto dialer technology, they were able to blanket individuals with hundreds of thousands of calls, leaving a callback number. About the same time, they shifted to the iTunes card, and what we learned in our investigation was the iTunes cards makes it very easy for them to flip the money. They no longer are paying middlemen to convert payments into money orders. They're now selling the iTunes cards on a third-party market and then pocketing the money immediately. And also, it's very difficult for law enforcement to trace that transaction.
John Breyault, explain the iTunes aspect here. He was just talking about why they were doing it, but how does it work? The caller tells you to pay the IRS with an iTunes gift card?
Yeah, that's actually exactly what happens. The iTunes gift card is a payment method, is one that we identified last year as emerging form of payment. Like I said before, they normally ask for wire transfers or maybe a prepaid debit card, but these iTunes cards, they'll call, they'll tell you to go to Target or to Best Buy and put money onto an iTunes gift card and then send them the code on the back of that card. That allows the scammer to immediately deduct the funds that were loaded onto that card from the card itself. And so now they have access to those funds, and as Mr. Camas said, they quickly sell those funds or access to those codes on a thriving black market. What we understand is that this is often located in East Asia. The robocallers that he's talking about who blanket consumers, that's another huge problem, because what happens is you have these call centers, often overseas, that using cheap internet technology can send out literally millions of phone calls to consumers in the hopes of scamming just a few. But it makes money for the scammers.
Millions of phone calls. When it comes to the IRS impersonation scam, how much money are we talking about has been scammed off regular people in the past couple of years? Well,
you know, the IRS impersonation scam is one that's grown. It's the #2 biggest complaint that the Federal Trade Commission heard about in 2016. In terms of the amount of money lost, it's hard to say because people don't always report when there are losses. What we do know is that for fraud losses overall, around $750 million in losses were reported to the FTC last year just from fraud. But as we also know with fraud, it's historically underreported crime, and we think that's just the tip of the iceberg. In reality, I think that the fraud losses from impersonation scams run into the billions of dollars.
And we're talking about it with John Breyault. Especially want to hear your stories if you've been a target or a victim of some of these scams. Phone lines are open. John's up first in Fairfax, Virginia, just across the Potomac River. John, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I just want to tell the guest that most of these calls are coming from India, and I really believe that a lot of people, when they hear about the IRS, the first thing they do, they freak out because some of the answers machines, it sounds like American voice. And what you need to do is, I was so shocked first time when I get the call. But when I checked the phone number where it's coming from, I realized that was a scam. But the reality is I spoke to some people, and the guest can correct me if I'm wrong. IRS, they don't call people. They send you a letter if they need something from you. And if you don't get a letter, you don't have to bother. But the reality is most of the target is the older people and people who are not educated. And I know some of my friends who already paid a couple $1,000 for these guys, and they regret. And this is really a serious problem. And I heard about that a couple of months ago. Someone get arrested in India who's doing this kind of action. Is that the case that they're still investigating people who are doing this kind of scam?
John, thanks for the call. John Breyault.
Yeah, so India is a center for impersonation scams of all kinds, and there's a number of reasons for that. Number one, it's because it's an English-speaking country, so you have a large pool of people who can speak the language of their intended victims in the U.S. There's also access to cheap VoIP calling technology, which allows them to blast out calls to Americans in the U.S., millions of them at a time. But it's also important to understand, and I think your caller talked about this, that the IRS does not contact consumers through the phone to tell you that you owe money. That is the big red flag. If someone calls you, says they're from the IRS, and asks for money, hang up, call the IRS, and let them know what happened. In terms of victims, I think that this runs the gamut from people with high education levels to low education levels. The key thing that these scammers are very good at is creating a sense of urgency. What they'll do is say, if you don't pay right now, we're going to deport you. We're going to put a negative mark on your credit rating. We're sending the cops right now, and stay on the phone with me until you go to the store and get me that iTunes gift card or that wire transfer. They're very good at manipulating the emotions of consumers, so it can affect anyone, really.
So a day before tax day, today might be a day when you're getting those urgent calls from some of these fraudsters?
Yeah, absolutely. The day before tax day, because it's a deadline that not only you and I know is coming up, the fraudsters know And they know that many Americans are anxious about that. And so what they'll do is we expect they're busy contacting consumers in the days and weeks leading up to tax day and the days after that for people who may have missed the deadline to try and make money basically off of consumers' fear of the government and what might happen if they don't pay their taxes on time.
Rock Falls, Illinois. Peggy, good morning.
Good morning. I have been having a lot of these calls also to my phone, and my daughter has too. And she ordered me something at Christmas time over her computer, over the internet. Since then, I don't know if they've traced it or how they've done it, but I've been receiving at least 6 to 8 calls a week. I contacted my senior center in Sterling. They gave me the national do not call list, and I reported it to them. But the calls keep continuing, and if it's not a number that's not in my phone that I don't recognize, that has like a 561 or something area code, I just don't even answer it. I just don't even answer it because I know it's a scam.
Peggy, thanks for the call. John, what can Peggy do?
So, Peggy, you are not alone. Many people start receiving these impersonation calls from scammers because their phone numbers, which is actually very valuable information to the scam artists, get on a list. And the scammers buy, trade, and fight over those lists all the time. And they do it because they can use those lists to call folks like you and millions of other Americans with exactly this type of impersonation scam. I'll tell you, you mentioned the fact that your caller ID shows a number and you don't answer. That's a good tactic. But know, too, that the scammers are very adept at making practically any number they want show up on your caller ID through a technique called caller ID spoofing. So don't answer those calls. Also, when you talk to the do not call list, that's a great step as well. It's a list run by the Federal Trade Commission that has millions of numbers on it, and legitimate marketers are supposed to pay attention to that and not call the numbers on that list. However, the scammers are criminals. They don't pay attention to the do not call list, even though they're committing a federal crime every time they call somebody who's on that list. They don't care. They're overseas. They're hard to reach.
The list that scam artists keep, how does one get on that list?
Well, the way you can get on that list, there's a lot of ways, actually. It could be anything from putting your phone number into the wrong website. It could be filling out a form at one of those, when you put the little slip to try and win the car at the mall. There are lots of ways that those numbers can get in scammers' hands. That's why we think that consumers should really start to think about their phone numbers the same way they would something like a Social Security number or some other valuable piece of information that they wouldn't disclose to just anyone. So be careful when you provide it. If someone asks you for a phone number as an identification method, to say, is there some other way that we could do this without my phone number? Just because that is such a valuable piece of information that scammers can make use of.
Let's go to Swanee, Georgia. Linda, good morning.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. I read yesterday an article about how Wells Fargo was fined about $148 million for some of the frauds and scams that their employees were creating, creating new accounts, moving people's money to another account. And I was wondering, why are these people never prosecuted? If you went and robbed a bank, you would obviously be prosecuted, but now they just call it inappropriate movement of money.
Well, that's a great question. I mean, certainly I think if these executives who were in charge of the Wells Fargo scam allowed it to happen on their watch, even encouraged it to happen, I should definitely think they would be found, or should be found, criminally negligent at the very least. But that said, this is a law enforcement matter. There's a lot of evidence that has to be gathered. And as we saw from the 2008 financial crisis, people who were responsible for billions or even trillions of dollars in losses never went to jail. So it's hard to say who's going to go to jail and who won't. But I agree that it's very frustrating when you see these things happen and executives get off scot-free.
What does the National Consumers League think the best policies are that can be advanced in this Congress to cut down on fraud and consumer scams?
Well, I think one thing that this Congress should do is take a look at data security standards. So as you were talking about valuable information like your cell phone number getting in the hands of scammers, that's information that I think all businesses and all organizations, frankly, who keep consumers' information should be required to keep secure and abide by reasonable data security. We've tried to pass legislation like this for well over a decade. Unfortunately, Congress hasn't taken steps. But yet at this time of tax day, when we see consumers' information getting misused by scammers, when we see these impersonation scams growing in number, when we see huge breaches like we saw at Yahoo with more than 1 billion records compromised, I think there's an impetus. Now is a time for Congress to step back and take a real look at the need for data security legislation that actually protects all consumers' data.
Lancaster, California's next. Glenn, good morning.
Yes. I'd like to talk about our last president, how he got away with our false press, didn't vet him. He had a Columbia University as a foreign student. He defrauded the people of the United States of America. I'd like to talk about how much money that was really spent here in California on the illegal population through the welfare systems and special. They have special money for it says immigrants, but they're not here legally. They didn't immigrate through like most people go to the embassies from their country and come here the right way.
Got your point, Glenn. John Breyault, are there any issues impacting immigrants or that the National Consumers League takes up?
Yeah, well, I'm glad your caller mentioned the vulnerability of undocumented immigrants in the United States. This is a population that we see is victimized often through scams such as notario scams. These are scams where you have people set up shop in often immigrant neighborhoods, claim they're offering legal services for a hefty fee, and in fact they're really offering nothing more than getting the person, in the best cases, in touch with information that they're already able to obtain for free. But I also caution that when we talk about impersonation scams, these imposters who call, they look for names that look like they might be from outside the United States, names that look Hispanic, for example, and they'll use that and they'll say that they are with immigration or threaten deportation as a way to get the immigrant to pay up. So immigrants are definitely especially vulnerable to frauds and scams at this time of year and throughout the year.
Burke, Virginia is next. Don, good morning.
Yes, good morning. You're talking about spam. I've been spammed by everything, from mail, entering sweepstakes, especially by email. They said, we represent FBI, even the White House. And I had to send a copy of it to the White House. And Michelle Obama, there's an image of spam. And also by text. How you can report these people? Okay, go ahead.
Don, before you go, what was the White House scam that...
Well, the scam the White House said that I won $60 million from some country, Benin, is mandated that the White House, that I give them my address. Of course, that didn't happen. I found out that Michelle Obama didn't have, there wasn't her email. I don't know what the heck was going on, so I said, send it to the White House for investigated, because they think all they got to do is go through Yahoo to find out who did it. Okay?
John Breyault.
So, spam continues to be a problem that bedevils all of us. I think it's important for consumers like your caller to take a look at these with a skeptical eye. Clearly, Michelle Obama is never going to send you an email saying that you won $60 million, but spammers who send out these phishing emails are very adept at tailoring them in such a way that would make them much more believable. So one of the scams that we've seen the FBI warning warning consumers about recently has been this business scams, business phishing scams, where they'll send an email into a corporate network and say, oh, you need to pay this contract, make it look like it comes from the president or the CEO of the company. And it's really an effort to get somebody to wire money to a scammer. But because that email looks like it's somebody from somebody you know and trust, you're more likely to take action on it. I think even when you get the kind of spam that the caller talked about, the really important thing to remember is, even if it may sound ridiculous to you, don't be tempted to click on any links or attachments to that email, because those links or that attachment could do things like install malware on your computer that can log your keystrokes. And what that can allow scammers to do is get access to your financial accounts, your email accounts, other sensitive information that can allow them to scam not only you, but also send out emails and other communication to people within your contact list. So it's not just about protecting you, it's also protecting everyone that you touch online.
What is fraud.org?
Fraud.org is one of our flagship consumer education and advocacy campaigns. Right now we have more than 100 articles on there about all kinds of scams. The scams like the imposter scam, like the phishing scams that I talked about. It's also a hub where we allow consumers to actually report their complaints directly to us. We take those complaints, we share them with a network of 200 law enforcement and consumer protection agencies. And in cases where a consumer may be right on the verge of falling victim to a scam, we have the ability to actually reach out to that consumer with a trained counselor and prevent them from sending money, or in the case where they've already been a victim, help put them in touch with resources that can help them report it and, importantly, not send more money.
One stat from the complaints that have been filed with fraud.org from 2016, the median loss was $600. That's double the $300 median loss from 2015. Why is that? Why is the cost of fraud going up?
Well, I think there's a lot of ways. Number one, the scammers are always looking for ways to improve their game. One of the ways we talked about was, instead of using wire transfer, where the Western Union and MoneyGram and companies that are involved in that have improved in trying to stop those fraudulent wire transfers from going through. So now the scammers are turning to the iTunes gift card, like Mr. Kim has talked about, where it's much harder to stop those fraudulent transactions. We also think because the scammers are using technology, like the VoIP calling technology from India, they're able to reach a lot more people and consequently get those people they do reach to send more money. So there's a lot of reasons that it went up, but certainly the advice to consumers is, no matter whether they're asking you for $20 or $10,000, always use caution. If you're concerned that it might not be true, you're not sure about it, take a minute, ask somebody you know and trust about this to find out, does this sound like a scam? I'm not sure, and wait before you send that money, because 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100 even, it's a scam and you should just never send the money.
A few minutes left to take your calls, hear your stories. Kelly, Rome, Georgia, go ahead.
Yes, sir. Thank you for taking my call. If you'll allow me just a second, I've been the victim, or my family has been the victim of identity theft and everything. I'm at the point to where I don't go online. I don't do anything. But in 2009, my tax return was, they basically had my Social Security and everything, and they took my tax return. And then again in 2000 and I think it was around 10, a company, I'm not going to name the company, they had the information, my social, my everything, and they sent a $600 they sent a $600 Bissell thing, and I called this company and I said, "Can you not stop that?" And it just rolls and rolls and rolls to where if you can get if you can get illegal papers and especially if you're in a like a Wi-Fi, like Starbucks or something.
Kelly, thanks for sharing your story. John Breyault on her experiences.
So Kelly's experience is not unusual. The problem is that once a consumer falls victim to a scam one time, their name, their information becomes much more valuable to other scammers. They buy and sell these lists of repeat victims among themselves so that they can continue to defraud people like Kelly. So she mentioned the tax identity fraud that she fell victim to. The information that's necessary to do that, especially back in the 2009 timeframe she talked about. This was an emerging scam at the time, very easy for fraudsters to file ahead of the legitimate taxpayer like Kelly and claim their claim their refund. And then she started receiving this Bissell she talked about. And now she's having additional fraud outreach, and especially that's very typical. So what I'd caution people like you, Kelly, and others who have been victims of fraud is to remain especially vigilant because now you're likely to receive more phone calls, more emails, more communications from the scammers. And if you ever receive one where you think that it doesn't sound right, you're not sure, the best course of action is just not to respond to the emails. Hang up the phone, don't send the money, and talk to somebody you know and trust to make sure that they're aware of what's going on. She mentioned at the very end the Wi-Fi. What we caution consumers is that when you're on a public Wi-Fi, like a Starbucks, for example, be very careful about doing things like sharing your sensitive financial information. So, for example, when I'm in a public library, for example, or in a coffee shop, I won't log into my bank's website to check my account balance. That's because sometimes those public Wi-Fi hotspots aren't as secure